Good evening. I'm your host, and this is Kenya News Update today. We begin with a developing story that has the world on edge. The United States and Israel launched surprise strikes on Iran last weekend in what the Pentagon has dubbed Operation Epic Fury. Washington insists this will be a limited campaign, over in a matter of weeks. But a growing chorus of experts and regional analysts warn this conflict could easily become America's next forever war. Tonight, we take a deep dive into the military, economic, and geopolitical realities that suggest this crisis is just beginning. We'll examine the immediate fallout, the global economic shockwaves, and what this means for Kenya and the African continent. This is our special report. Let's start with the facts on the ground. On March 3, 2026, at approximately 9:15 a.m. local time, U.S. and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes against multiple targets inside Iran. The operation, which involved over 120 aircraft and naval assets, targeted suspected nuclear research facilities, Revolutionary Guard bases, and air defense systems. Initial reports from Tehran indicate significant damage to infrastructure in the capital. The U.S. Department of Defense has confirmed the deployment of an additional 15,000 personnel to the U.S. Central Command region to bolster existing forces. President Donald Trump, in a brief statement from the White House, framed the action as a necessary and precise response to years of Iranian aggression, promising a swift conclusion. This is not an invasion. This is not an occupation. We will achieve our objectives and our forces will come home, he stated. But military analysts are already questioning that timeline. The core of Washington's optimism lies in a specific tactical assessment. U.S. intelligence suggests that a sustained, high-intensity air campaign lasting 4 to 6 weeks could degrade Iran's military capabilities by an estimated 60 to 70%, particularly its ability to project power through proxies. Pentagon planners believe this level of degradation would satisfy the mission's declared objectives without requiring a ground invasion. However, this assessment is hotly contested. Retired General Mark Milley, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told CNBC the assumption that Iran will simply absorb these blows and not escalate regionally or asymmetrically is dangerously naive. They have spent 40 years building a network of militias from Yemen to Lebanon. You cannot bomb that away. Indeed, within 48 hours of the initial strikes, Hezbollah launched over 80 rockets into northern Israel, and Houthi forces in Yemen claimed attacks on 2 commercial vessels in the Red Sea. The conflict is already spreading. This brings us to the first major point of contention, the forever war risk. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades entangled in prolonged conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan at a staggering human and financial cost. The American public and political establishment are deeply wary of another open-ended commitment. The Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 was largely driven by this fatigue. Now, the Trump administration is trying to navigate the same political landscape. Secretary of Defense, in a press briefing, was adamant. We have learned the lessons of the past. Operation Epic Fury has defined endpoints, clear metrics for success, and an exit strategy. But what are those metrics? And who defines success? If the goal is the total dismantling of Iran's nuclear program, that likely requires ground forces. If the goal is merely to send a message, history shows such messages are often ignored or met with escalation. Let's visualize the immediate military challenge. The U.S. and Israel are facing an adversary with significant asymmetric advantages. While the U.S. leads in conventional firepower, Iran's strength lies in its regional network and its ability to wage a protracted, low-cost war of attrition. Financially, the cost of even a limited war is immense. The U.S. Congressional Budget Office provided a preliminary estimate to lawmakers this week. They project that a 6-week air campaign, at the current intensity, would cost approximately $8 to $10 billion. However, that figure excludes long-term costs like veteran care, replenishment of expended munitions, and economic impacts. If the conflict expands to include a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz or significant ground operations, costs could skyrocket to $50 to $75 billion within the first year. For context, the U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan. The question for American taxpayers and lawmakers is whether they are prepared to sign another blank check for a conflict with an uncertain outcome. Beyond the battlefield, the economic shockwaves are being felt globally, and Africa is on the front lines. Oil prices, which were relatively stable at around $78 per barrel last week, have surged. As of market close today, Brent crude is trading at $112 per barrel, a 44% increase. This spike is a direct result of the conflict and the threat it poses to shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf, through which about 20% of the world's oil passes. For oil importing nations in Africa, this is a crisis. The African Union's Directorate of Trade and Industry released an urgent advisory today, warning member states of impending fuel shortages and inflationary pressure. They estimate the continent's collective import bill for petroleum products could rise by $15 to $20 billion this year if prices remain elevated. This is not just an abstract market movement. This translates directly to higher costs for transportation, agriculture, and electricity, stifling economic growth and pushing more people into poverty. Kenya is particularly vulnerable. According to data from the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, Kenya imports 100% of its petroleum products. A sustained price of $112 per barrel could add 500 million shillings per day to the national import bill. The government's Fuel Stabilization Fund, which was already under strain, would be exhausted within weeks at that rate. This would force either a sharp increase in pump prices or drastic cuts to other budgetary areas like healthcare and education. President William Ruto's administration has been silent on contingency plans, but Treasury Cabinet Secretary is scheduled to address Parliament tomorrow. The economic fallout from a distant war is now a direct domestic policy emergency. This brings us to the second source in our research, which frames this crisis as Africa's wake-up call on oil dependency. The article argues that the turmoil in the Middle East exposes the profound vulnerability of economies tied to fossil fuels. When geopolitical conflict disrupts supply chains, importing nations are held hostage to price volatility. The solution, the argument goes, is an accelerated pivot to renewable energy. Kenya is actually a leader in this field, with over 90% of its grid electricity coming from renewable sources like geothermal, hydro, and wind. However, the transportation sector remains almost entirely dependent on imported diesel and petrol. This conflict highlights the urgent need to electrify transport and develop local energy resilience. As one African energy analyst put it, every dollar spent on importing fuel is a dollar not spent on building our own future. This war, started by others, must be our final lesson. The geopolitical ramifications are equally complex. The US-led strikes have not been met with universal support. At the United Nations Security Council, Russia and China condemned the action as a violation of international law. In capitals across the global south, from Seoul to Nairobi, protesters have taken to the streets. In Seoul today, thousands marched toward the US Embassy, condemning what they called an illegal act of aggression. This global dissent matters. It undermines the moral authority the US seeks to project and makes it harder to build a lasting coalition for any post-conflict stabilization efforts. For a continent like Africa, which has historically been caught in the crossfire of great power rivalries, there is a palpable fear of being forced to choose sides in a new Cold War-style confrontation. The African Union's principle of non-alignment is being tested like never before. So, where do we go from here? The experts we consulted see three most likely scenarios, none of them quick or clean. Scenario 1, a stalemate. The US air campaign continues for 6 weeks, inflicting damage but failing to cripple Iran's leadership or proxy network. Iran continues asymmetric attacks across the region. The conflict settles into a grinding, low-level war of attrition with occasional spikes in violence. This could last for years. Scenario 2, regional conflagration. Iran successfully triggers a multi-front war, activating Hezbollah for a full-scale conflict with Israel and encouraging Shia militias in Iraq to attack US bases. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states could be drawn in. This would be catastrophic for global oil supplies and could trigger a worldwide recession. Scenario 3, diplomatic off-ramp. Under intense international pressure, a ceasefire is negotiated, perhaps through intermediaries like Oman or Qatar. However, this would require face-saving concessions from both sides, which seem unlikely given the current rhetoric. President Trump would have to accept something less than total victory, and Iran's supreme leader would have to accept a humiliating bombardment without equivalent response. For Kenya and East Africa, the path forward involves urgent risk mitigation. First, the government must activate emergency plans to cushion the economy from oil price shocks. This could involve temporary subsidies, tax reductions, or accelerated investment in public transport. Second, diplomacy is crucial. Kenya should use its seat on the UN Security Council and its voice within the African Union to advocate fiercely for de-escalation and a return to dialogue. The continent's interests lie in stability and open shipping lanes, not in a prolonged war. Finally, this crisis must reinvigorate the continental conversation on energy independence. The African Continental Free Trade Area could be leveraged to promote intra-African energy partnerships and renewable technology transfer. In conclusion, while the White House insists this will not be a forever war, the mechanics of the conflict suggest otherwise. The combination of Iran's asymmetric strategy, the global economic interdependencies, and the historical pattern of mission creep in U.S. military interventions creates a perfect storm for prolonged entanglement. The bombs falling on Tehran are already echoing in Nairobi, manifesting as higher fuel prices and economic anxiety. This conflict, perhaps more than any other in recent memory, demonstrates how interconnected our world has become. A war in the Persian Gulf is no longer a distant event, it is a local crisis. The experts beg to differ with Washington's optimism because they are reading the map of reality, not the map of hope. The coming weeks will determine whether this becomes a brief, violent chapter or the opening volley in a decades-long struggle. For Kenya News Update Today, I'm your host. Subscribe to Kenya News Update Today for continuing coverage. Thank you and good night.